Morning, everybody. We're here to talk about the capital campaign feasibility study. This is closing a little loop. I think most of these people are here that are on the capital campaign visioning committee, but I really want to thank all these folks. It's a great group of people. Oh. Okay, that's what I want. This is context and background that probably most of you have already seen and are aware of, but just want to remind you that the genesis of the capital campaign scoping process was a sustainability and stewardship committee that looked at sort of finances writ large in the church. And one of the things they recommended was to scope out a capital campaign. So we were formed over a year ago to do that. There also was a lot of additional work done by others. The Board of Business and their Building and Grounds Committee got a professional sort of scoping of this church's infrastructure and then spent a year working on putting prices on what it would take to basically do that monster to-do list to bring our infrastructure up to where it needed to be. From that, this committee put together basically two project lists. One that, guided by that other group's work, we considered essential. Essential repairs and improvements needed to sort of catch up on deferred maintenance and bring the church buildings and grounds up to where they needed to be so we could move forward. That was one list, and then also a visionary projects list that if we, decided we could raise the money, this would be extra projects we could potentially do that would be more visionary. This list was in the neighborhood of 1.2 million, and then we had another $1 million or so worth of visionary things that we could potentially do. Those project lists, we presented them at the January 2024 congregational meeting, and the congregation authorized the hiring of a consultant to do a feasibility study to interview a subset of the congregation and basically make a call as to where we are with regard to readiness to carry out a capital campaign. With the authorization of a capital campaign to be considered depending on the results of the study. The idea was that we would present the results of that feasibility study at the May congregational meeting, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, with a potential vote at that point on whether to undertake a capital campaign. The headline that I'll give you now before everything else is that there's some work that needs to be done, and we're not ready to embark on a capital campaign yet. So rather than presenting the results of this study at the congregational meeting, since it would essentially be informational, we're doing that now. I think many of you have probably already seen the written summary report, but this is sort of the verbal presentation of that. So this is closing that loop since the congregation paid for the feasibility study. I want to talk about what it said. I'm just going to have to say next slide, I guess. All right. So the feasibility study was carried out by Jill White. She's a consultant with the United Church of Christ Building and Loan Fund. She works with UCC congregations on fundraising and on especially capital fundraising. She carried out 30-minute interviews with 36 people. Just want to point out that it was necessary to do a sample, which means to talk to a subset of people. There wasn't time to talk to everybody. So just wanted to remind you that if you weren't in that group of people that she interviewed, that doesn't mean your input is not valuable. We just had to do a subset. Criteria for selecting interviewees: we wanted heavily engaged folks, both newer and longer term members. We wanted to include people that might be opposed to the campaign, And in the end, you know, what we try to do with all of these types of things was, as best we can, make it a representative cross-section of the congregation. Jill asked two types of questions: quantitative questions, which was, you know, sort of a Likert scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, on a number of different issues. And she used that for calculating a probability of success, which was actually a number. And then she also asked a bunch of open-ended questions as well. Next. Before I jump into what she found, I want to point out the demographics of who she interviewed. And I think we did pretty well in terms of representativeness. So this is years of UCG membership, ranging from less than 10 years as a UCG member to 50 or more. And really, about half of the interviewees had been members for 20 years or less, half had been members for 20 years or more. We wanted, you know, engaged congregants, and, you know, the vast majority of interviewees attend church, you know, 30 or more Sundays a year. None of the interviewees attend 10 or fewer Sundays. Employment, about half the interviewees were retired, half were still working. That may actually skew a little bit more towards working relative to membership. And then in terms of gender, interviewed 21 females and 15 males, which probably also is pretty representative of the active congregation. So I was pretty pleased. I think at least in terms of these demographics, this is representative of our congregation. Next slide. So Jill calculated a probability of success. And I was talking with someone before the service. The probability of success she calculated was 62%, which is a very exact number. I didn't even put that number here because I think that's a little bit of false precision in calculating a number like that. She characterized that number as saying that number is within the typical probability of success range that she calculates for congregations. So we sort of were typical of the congregations that she interviews. She said the score is an indication that the congregation could proceed with the capital campaign after considering the findings of the study and recommendations of the consultant. So we could be successful if we address some of the barriers that exist. So that was the take home from the study. Next slide. So Jill listed 6 criteria that she considers important for a successful capital campaign. First, that the congregation is united in support of the projects that are put forth as being funded by the campaign, that there's no significant issue in the congregation's life that requires resolution, that there are supportive and satisfied relationships among church members, the projects are for construction or renovation and are ministry and mission focused, the right leadership for the capital campaign is recruited, and that annual giving shows a financial readiness. Okay, so these are the 6 criteria. And she said, okay, there are some issues with a number of these. And she identified what some of those issues were. So I'm going to show you some of those. Next slide. So criteria 1 and 4 related to support of the projects and whether the projects are ministry or mission focused. Said many of the interviewees commented that some projects would be nice, but are not essential. Some of the respondents supported the idea of a campaign, but perhaps with other projects. Okay. Several respondents wanted a better explanation of the projects, their costs, and why they are needed. That's a reasonable request. There was some confusion over those 2 lists, the essentials versus visionary. Several saw the goal of the capital campaign as being over $3 million rather than starting at that 1.2 million spot. The list of projects needs clear delineation. Many shared positive comments supporting the projects, what the committee has done, and the information shared. So they threw us a bone on that. Okay. Next slide. No significant issues with the congregation and supportive and satisfied relationships. Everybody knows that we're in transition right now, and there's lots of stuff going on in the church. The lack of a third pastor came up repeatedly. Some were concerned about the heavy workload on the current two pastors. And then some expressed concerns over us being in an important and challenging period of transition, making it a difficult time to undertake a capital campaign. In other words, you don't want to do a generational capital campaign when there is other important unfinished business in the congregation. Okay, next slide. And then criteria 6, are we financially ready? Many respondents perceive that not meeting the last enlistment campaign goal signifies a lack of readiness for the capital campaign. So those are essentially the findings. She said, we're in good shape, but there are a number of things that we need to address before we should move forward on a capital campaign. So next slide. We're flying here. So, I consider these some things to be addressed. We need to explore and discuss project details. So we've got a great buildings and grounds committee that's done all this work. We as a committee and the congregation as a congregation needs to better understand what is on that list, why they're on the list, why they cost what we say they're going to cost, and we can talk about that. So we're going to embark on that conversation because those are really important conversations. There are perceptions of the church's financial readiness or lack thereof. We want to talk with Board of Business about where we are with regard to that and what kinds of congregational conversations we need to have about that. And then, of course, anxiety related to the church in transition. That's not something that we address as a capital campaign visioning committee. Those are things we're addressing in a much larger sense as a congregation. So those are some things that we're going to be doing. You'll be hearing from us over the summer and into the fall. I do want to make sure that everyone understands we're not going to have a capital campaign until we're ready. Okay? We're not going to do this prematurely. That would be terrible. So nobody wants that. And I won't advocate for that. I do want to say, though, at the same time, it's important that we not lose momentum. Buildings and Grounds has done an enormous amount of work over the last 18 months and is working on stuff. We're working on the seminar rooms. Phoebe, is repurposing our seminar rooms. There already have been repairs underway, work on drainage. There's all sorts of work ongoing. One of the things I want to ensure is that we don't forget about that. We don't forget about the list, the to-do list that we have, and that regardless of what happens with the capital campaign, that we keep plugging away on that necessary work. It can get done. A lot of that can get done without a capital campaign. All of it can't. I think some of it will require a capital campaign, but we can make progress, and it's important not to forget about that part. We'll get to you in a second, Pradeep. Next slide. I think this is my last one. If any of you use QR codes, you can download the feasibility study summary. It was also in the newsletter and an email. So hopefully you all have already read that, but if you haven't, it's available. And at this point, we're ready for questions, if anybody has questions. Pradeep?
You need a microphone.
Oh. Okay. Mic is so that people online can hear you.
I don't know, maybe I'm asking this question too early, but I like the consultants to tell me what were the assumptions in their study. And so, for instance, the one thing which kind of buzzes in my head is this church going to stay here at physical location? I think the answer is yes. But Should the answer be yes?
That is out of the scope of this committee. Sir, yeah, that's an assumption, I think.
I mean. Okay. There's so much going on. We can't say building.
Yeah, I think Pradeep, the specific assumption you mentioned about moving, no, the assumption was that we were going to do work on the current church physical plant and not move. I think the other, stated assumption was this was the amount, 1.2 million was the stated sort of minimum of a capital campaign. And that was what she was talking with people about when she asked them about a capital campaign. So that was the other assumption, was the size of the capital campaign.
I've got the microphone. Quick question. We use the term transition a lot, but it isn't really defined. And I'm curious, what other than the fact that we are talking about having 2 or 3 ministers, but what are all the transition things are we talking about?
Well, we're moving towards a new staffing model, and there have been a lot of questions and some degree of controversy about how that's been rolled out. We just had a town hall about that. So I think there are a number of issues like that that are in the front of the congregation's mind that need to be resolved before we do something like this. Okay, Carol was first and then Ann.
I just wanted to address the idea of moving versus get this campus back together again. We have an aging campus, and the $1.3 million is based on bringing it refreshed, get it back to like when it was built initially. It's not any extra projects. And so, when we're talking about drainage or retention or parking lots or refreshing the kitchen, these are all items that are what we call rehab. And those are essential repairs because they're failing and they've withstood their test of time, but now they're not necessarily functioning, or they're a safety hazard. We did consider as a committee, do we need to move from here? And there was such a up in arms idea of like move out to get more land out away from the central location. And there was such resistance that we decided to focus on repairing our campus back to its original condition. Building and grounds, and actually the capital campaign folks and Bromley we all worked very hard discussing these items that concern. Priority is the biggest thing, and safety is the biggest thing on the priority list.
Ann?
Well, I have a number of thoughts about this, but I think moving would be way, way more expensive than 1.2 million. Because we either have to buy another building or build another building and buy land, and 1 million is cheap compared to that. The feasibility study was done before this most recent issue with the staffing reorganization. And so that I think has thrown the sort of anxiety to a much higher level than when the feasibility study was done.
Mm-hmm.
So we certainly need to address that first. I think one of the hardest things about the list of projects, and I understand they're essential, but to spend $500,000 on a parking lot is like a big mountain to climb for people that, to give money to. So, and I understand that once you get engineers involved and it just has to be done, but that's a hard ask, I think, when the biggest project is a parking lot.
The parking lot is the most challenging item on this list.
Yeah.
Because it's half that total amount. And I think many people park in the parking lot on a regular basis and say, why would we need to do this? So I think that, those questions exist in our committee. Those questions probably exist to some level in building and ground. So clearly it's something that needs more work in terms of us understanding better. Okay, Rebecca next, and then Glenn.
I just had a question on if the consultant provided any feedback on the amount. Like, I know you said there's like the 1.3, but then there's also the visionary. Like, does it make sense to go into it with this split amount? Or like, does it make better sense to
think
go
so.
and do as a whole? Like, did she provide any sort of
Focused on the
guidance on that?
1.2, but again, I
Okay.
think the ability to be precise about the amount is limited. So I think she was sort of asking people about the 1.2 million amount and going from there.
Just a comment about the 1.2, 1.3 million projected for the essential, my name is Glenn Mans, on the essential projects. And Carol, correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but the time frame that Buildings and Grounds has been discussing is over a 5-year period. It's not 1-year deal or 2-year deal. It is to be done over 5 years. For instance, the roof on the sanctuary will be a large item, but it isn't projected to be re-roofed until I think 5 years from now or 4 years from now. So it's not a one-shot 1.23 million thing that we have to swallow in the next 6 months, which should be taken into account as well.
Correct. And even if we started a capital campaign, the fulfillment of that campaign would happen over multiple years. So all of the things we're talking about are going into the medium-term future. Yeah.
Tim, I wanted to thank you for bringing attention to the fact that these repairs still need to go on. Example, Unit 12 is 28 years old and leaking freon now. That's servicing the educational wing with another unit, 2 other units. And there's 14 units on campus, and we've only done 5 of them. One is a 30-year unit in the sanctuary. We need to escrow money to deal with repairs in the future. We don't want to spend money on a piece of equipment that has gone way past its life expectancy. And so I appreciate you bringing that attention.
I think one of the most valuable things about this whole process that Buildings and Grounds and Capital Campaign has done, it's brought all of this conversation to the congregation. I think the congregation is much more aware and cognizant of what brought us to this place and then what needs to be done to move forward. So I think that, for instance, changes the conversations we have about our enlistment campaign and funding the capital reserves line, for instance. I think people have a much better understanding of why that's important. So it's great.
I was going to ask if people have some suggestions about how we could achieve those goals of people really understanding what the projects are and the costs, because there have been a number of meetings to discuss that, and I'm not fussing at people who didn't attend. I'm not fussing at people who attended and still don't quite get it, but how do we make sure that communication happens in a more effective way?
I think one of the things that, we talked with Eric Smith and Stephen Bottomley about, who are now leading Buildings and Grounds, was just start going down the list. Let's have a workshop on plumbing. Let's dig up the water line and look at the 1.5-inch water line that's feeding the campus and talk about why that's inadequate. 3/4 inch. That's even worse. And it's probably galvanized, so it's probably 1/4 inch.
Yeah.
Only one line. Oh my gosh, the the water supply. At any rate, I think we just start going down the list. I suggested to Eric that we start with the parking lot because, oh my God. He said, let's start with something easier like plumbing and work our way up to the parking lot. So we may talk about plumbing first, but we'll get to the parking lot. It's the asphalt elephant in the room. Robin?
Did the outside consultant give you all advice about how to handle when the church is in this kind of transition of concern about pastor's level of burnout, staffing changes? What you set forth was those would be obstacles that have to be dealt with. Did the outside consultant, since she does this for churches all the time, give you all her expertise in how to address that? Because you could argue that some of the trouble we got in with the other stuff is when the perception is that some outside concern is more important than people's needs in a situation. You see what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think the scope of her work was to identify the obstacles, and she didn't really go into how to address those because, of course, those are very internal and UCG and would require.
First church that faces.
Not at all. Not at all. No, her report really focused on summarizing the responses and what the implications of those were for moving forward or not. But, clearly, there's work to be done and some of it's not trivial.
I'd just like to remind people that for many years, I don't even know since I've been here of any year when we didn't have trouble meeting the budget for the upcoming year.
It was 1 year.
Oh, 1 year.
We didn't have to have it supplemented.
And lots of times when we had that, one of the first things the first thing to go on the budget was capital, not campaign, but just reserve in there. And so this has all been piling up now for years.
And Tim alluded to this earlier as well as Carol about the capital reserve fund. And so I just want to add on to what was just said, that apparently that message has begun to sink in now. And I just would like to thank the BOB or the Board of Business folks and the other folks responsible for making sure that capital reserve fund is being properly funded now. So that when that, not if, but when that AC unit goes that Carol was talking about, there will be some funds there to replace it without having to go around and pick people's pockets basically to go ahead and replace that air conditioner. My understanding is that there's about $57,000 in that fund, which sounds like a lot of money. But if you have a major problem in whatever, that shrinks down real quick. And thank goodness we're not robbing that fund now for other items so that we can meet the emergency repairs as they come up. So that's a very essential point that was brought up there. And we'll maintain the momentum for maintaining the physical facilities around here.
As a previous Bob chair, I feel very guilty for having done that.
Not your fault.
I know.
We forgive you.
Would it be appropriate to have an itemized budget that we presented to everyone, to the congregation? Because we were talking about the questions that I hear were, well, I'm not quite sure I understand about that project and what it involves and whatever.
Kristen, can you go to the next slide?
So
Maybe next slide. Yeah. So this was another QR code. So this is the document that we presented at the congregational meeting. So it has the itemized budget lists and then a little paragraph about,
each one,
about each
okay.
group of items. that's sort of the first level of detail. But clearly, it's not sufficient. And I think one of the problems we ran into was because the amount of work needed to generate all of those numbers and all of that detail, we were running right up to December council meeting. So there just wasn't time for us to do that really deep conversation about those lists. And so now is the time to do that.
Like if I remember, the courtyard area was a tremendous amount of money. And I didn't quite appreciate what that meant until I talked to Glenn.
Mhm.
Said, and he said, well, when I bring in the backhoes and we do this and that, that's what it's going to cost. So I'm wondering if we could have more details so that people understand when they say X dollars for a particular project, even though they've itemized that it's going to, where it's going to
Yeah.
be, that it could be even more.
Absolutely. And, there are a couple of items that I really encourage everybody to look at this material again. When I was talking with Eric and Stephen, I had to remind them about the details of some of these and where we'd arrived. So for instance, the courtyard, there's sort of two levels of approach. The level that's in the essentials list is fairly small. The sort of big $150,000, $200,000 level is in the visionary list. The kitchen, there's sort of two levels in the kitchen. The level that's in the essentials list right now is the sort of, let's put appliances in there that work and maybe spruce it up. The visionary one is, a couple $100,000 commercial kitchen. So I really encourage people to sort of look at that. And, I think what we want is to come to consensus that what is on the essentials list, that we all agree that it's essential. That's important. So I think, like you said, we just need to understand better. Carol?
I just
Yeah.
wanted to clarify that a lot of the estimates were done through me. And I can easily confess that some of them were figures pulled out of the sky because of my experience. The other part is that we actually had clearing contractors and other contractors and roofers and AC contractors all give us hard figures, plumbers, electricians. So the figures are really not that far out. However, they're a moving target. They keep going up. And we have drawings. We've had designs done. The renovation of the bathrooms over here are actually on our radar. And the kitchen remodel, be it a commercial or just a refresh, all those things have to be drawn to pull a permit to do. So we've done a lot of that footwork already. And I'm real sorry that everybody seems to think that the parking lot is not essential, but we are, our retention ponds have not been maintained since we built them. And those retention ponds deal with the stormwater, which now we're dumping on the street instead of putting them into the ponds that we developed. So that is a priority in my mind, because this south face of Reimer Hall is falling. It's gone down over a half an inch over time. And so, everything's connected to, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone. It goes all the way out to the parking lot. And that parking lot is falling apart. And
I think that, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Is
and
bringing us all along to the level of understanding we need to make informed decisions.
And I do think it's very hard to pull out one single thing. I think there's a bigger picture.
Absolutely.
So,
Sally?
I just wondered if is there a link on our website to these documents rather than the QR code? I'd rather look at them on my computer.
I'll ask Shauna to put links to these two documents. I think there's a resources tab.
Yeah, I think there is.
And I'll ask her to do that.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Glenn?
in reference to the question about the courtyard, there's a whole wide range of estimates depending on what the congregation would like to see in the yard. That hasn't been firmly defined yet. There's a grand plan that Glenn probably shared with you. But there's also, well, we don't do anything, And so there's a wide range and whatever of visions on what to do with the courtyard. And I would like to emphasize that we really need a lot of input, specific input from the congregation as to what they feel we would like to see in the courtyard in the future. I think we all enjoy it, and we realize that there's some things that need to be done, but we don't know the degree to which the congregation would like to change. And so it's really important. And that, of course, will affect the cost in the long run as well. Sure enough. The thing about the parking lot, we got water coming out of that entrance of that parking lot that if we get a 3-inch rain in an hour and a half, it's going to back up into our courtyard from the street. In my mind, anyway, and we've gone head to head all this stuff many times. If we do anything, we've got to stem the flow of the drainage of water coming out of that parking lot, because it is a torrent, and it is powering the drainage that has been established by the city. Thank you.
Went from 9 inches that this was designed for, it's now designed for 24 inches. The newest construction.
Is there a process for the congregation to make these priorities that Glenn was talking about? I mean, I think the uncertainty of I'm giving to level 1 of the kitchen, but not level 2. I'm giving to one plan for the parking lot, for the courtyard, but not, to the, I think perhaps that was a confusion that the consultants were seeing. Are we giving to a 1.2 million project that does this? Or if we give more, where does it go? And so how do we get that level of clarity?
I think, my perspective on that is that the first step is getting clarity on what the projects are and why they're on that list. And then I think after we feel like we've sort of gone through at least the major pieces, then there can be a conversation about, okay, are we all on the same page that now that we've talked about the parking lot and the kitchen and the plumbing and the safety items and the bathrooms, do we agree, or is there consensus that those still belong on the list? So I view that question as sort of coming after let's talk about exactly what these are and why we're doing them.
Yeah, and there's also a certain amount of logic that needs to go to it. As an engineer, why first thing you deal with is the infrastructure. Get the water, the electricity, the sewer, the way you want it for the future, and then add a little extra, and then worry about the other parts.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your attention to all this.